Chosen one, you're not here by coincidence. You're here on purpose. You've always felt it, that quiet pull, that inner knowing that didn't come with proof, just fire. You weren't crazy. You weren't too much. You were just early. While others chased comfort, you carried clarity. While they blended in, you built backbone. And now the moment you were made for has arrived. This isn't your breakdown. This is your breakthrough. You didn't survive all that pain for applause. You endured it to lead when the lights went out. You're not the echo. You're the origin. The room didn't shift by accident when you walked in. That was purpose taking its rightful place. So if your voice was ever dismissed, if your presence was ever misunderstood, welcome. You're not just seen now. You're needed. And not because you demanded the moment, but because the moment finally caught up to you. Let them watch. Let them wonder. You're not here to prove anything. You're here to embody everything. Let's begin. Some of you don't just notice what's wrong. You feel it before it even surfaces. You speak up, not for drama, not for spotlight, but because staying silent would be dishonest to what you know deep down. And still, people flinch when you talk, not because you're wrong, but because you interrupt the comfort of pretending. They'd rather mock the messenger than confront the truth sitting in their lap. But don't worry, truth doesn't expire. It waits. And now, it's knocking on every door they tried to keep shut. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. You weren't forecasting, you were translating. While others relied on analytics and applause to define what's real, you read the shift from the inside out. You didn't learn this in classrooms or on curated panels. You learned it walking barefoot through places others refuse to admit even exist. So when the foundation starts trembling and everything carefully polished begins to unravel, you don't panic. You've seen this story before, just with different names, different costumes, same decay. But they couldn't accept that someone without a platform or a pedigree could see what their experts missed. You didn't speak in buzzwords or brand deals, so they dismissed you as emotional, extreme, too intense. But now, the same ones who rolled their eyes scroll through headlines with that strange mix of guilt and déjà vu. Not because you were loud, but because you were accurate. And that truth? It ages like stone, silent, unshakable, and still standing after the illusions collapse. They thought you were stirring chaos, but you were naming patterns. They thought you were bitter, but you were bearing witness. What they couldn't sit with wasn't your message, it was their own reflection inside it. Because to hear you meant admitting they clapped for convenience, stood beside corruption, and called it leadership. You didn't bring destruction, you brought exposure. And exposure doesn't make a mess. It shows one that was already there. Step beyond the screen, join, and help light the way for others. Now they scramble to recalibrate while you walk steady, unmoved. Not because you have all the answers, but because you never needed the noise to trust what you knew. They call it hindsight, you call it alignment. And while they pace in confusion, you simply nod, because this isn't you finally being right. This is what happens when reality catches up to the truth it kept ignoring. Some people don't call you out because you're off. They call you out because you're on target, and that scares them. They twist your clarity into criticism because it's easier to call you the problem than face the fractures you reveal. You're not trying to ruin peace. You're pointing out it was never real to begin with. You're not fueled by fear. You're built from discernment. And the moment you speak, it hits nerves not because you're wrong, but because you're dangerously close to the truth they've been avoiding. You catch details others dismiss. You notice patterns others ignore. You question what they protect. And suddenly, you're too much, too intense, too suspicious. But what's really happening is that your insight shines too bright for people used to living in comfortable shadows. They'd rather question your sanity than question the systems they cling to. You don't carry paranoia, you carry precision. But owning that would mean they have to change. And change terrifies people addicted to stability, even if it's built on lies. They'd rather brand you as unstable than admit you're tuned into something they don't understand. They laugh to feel safe. But when the very things you warned about start collapsing, the smirks vanish. What used to be written off as coincidence now looks like confirmation. What they dismissed as overreaction now plays out scene for scene. And you're not surprised. You were never guessing. You were just speaking from a place they weren't ready to hear. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. Now the cracks are visible, and your voice, the one they labeled too sharp, too loud, too disruptive, is the one echoing in their minds. They're not dealing with someone who made lucky guesses. They're reckoning with the fact that your theories were never theories. They were unspoken truths no one else wanted to say out loud. You weren't the chaos. You were the clarity. And now that the silence is broken, they can't pretend not to hear you anymore. They called it bitterness, but what they really feared was your boldness. Labeling you angry made it easier to tune you out. If they could convince others you were emotional, irrational, difficult, they wouldn't have to wrestle with the sharp edge of your truth. But anger doesn't come with evidence. Frustration doesn't come with timing, accuracy, or depth. What you carried wasn't rage, it was warning. And what they painted as resentment was actually the burden of insight. You didn't speak from offense, you spoke from urgency. You weren't hoping to prove a point. You were hoping to protect people from what you already saw coming. But they weren't ready. They needed the collapse to finally hear the sound of your words with different ears. You didn't throw shade, you held up a mirror, and now that reflection is staring back, undeniable. The receipts are real. The dots have connected, and that label they tried to stick to you no longer holds, because the narrative has flipped. It's not about who yelled first. It's about who was right the whole time. And this time, the proof speaks louder than the dismissal ever did. They're not shaken because you're wrong. They're shaken because someone like you was never supposed to be that clear. You speak without title, without sponsorship, without the stamp of systems they trust. And that's exactly what threatens them. Your clarity didn't come from permission. It came from depth. You weren't handed power, you cultivated presence. And in a world obsessed with image, that kind of substance is considered a disruption. They operate in rooms built on status and approval, and here you come, uninvited and unbothered, telling truths they paid good money to avoid. You weren't supposed to notice. You weren't supposed to speak. You weren't supposed to matter. But your words echo because they hold weight, and that weight doesn't require their validation. What exposes them isn't your tone, it's your accuracy. And they know if you're right, the whole structure they stand on is paper thin. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. So they label, they whisper, they twist narratives to make your presence look like rebellion instead of revelation. They can't disprove your message, so they target the messenger. If they can discredit you, They don't have to address what you bring to light. You're not dangerous because you shout. You're dangerous because you don't need to. You don't seek their spotlight. You bring your own. And that's what rattles the system. You're not here for praise. You're not here for permission. You carry what was placed in you. And that alone makes you untouchable. They can't contain it, so they try to erase it. But truth doesn't fade, and neither do those born to deliver it. They thought ignoring you would silence the signal. But now, the very things they dismissed unfold exactly as you spoke them. Not through force, but through alignment. You weren't just forecasting chaos. You recognized the terrain because it shaped you. While others panic as things fall apart, you stand still. Not because you enjoy the fall, but because you've already walked through worse. You don't study instability, you survived it. And that survival taught you how to read the room long before it started shaking. The breakdown they're experiencing is the backdrop of your becoming. What feels like an earthquake to them is just familiar ground to you. You don't flinch because you've already lived through versions of this with fewer resources, less support, and no applause. They hear warning sirens. You hear echoes of a past you've already made peace with. They didn't take you seriously because you didn't speak their language. You didn't soften your tone to protect their comfort. You came with what they called too much, but it was exactly what the moment required. Now that their illusions are breaking, they start to remember everything you said, the pain you tried to prevent, the masks you called out, the truths they dismissed as anger. And now they ask how you knew. But you didn't learn it in theory. You lived it. Every bruise, every betrayal, every long night taught you what books never could. You didn't guess. You remembered. What they just now call a disaster, you once called daily life. You made wisdom out of wreckage. And that's why your voice carries what theirs can't. Proof. They used to roll their eyes. Now they search your words like a map. Not because you changed, but because reality caught up. They finally realize you weren't just warning them. You were living through what they didn't believe existed. And now they no longer see you as dramatic. They see you as prepared. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. They act like your presence is disruptive until silence surrounds them and your voice is the only one that ever made sense. When everything's fine, they wave you off like static. You're too real, too raw, too willing to speak on what they're still pretending not to feel. You unsettle them. You break their script. They want nods, not nudges. They want peace, even if it's false, as long as no one threatens to peel the cover back. But the moment their safe spaces collapse, the people they depended on vanish, and their well-rehearsed answers fall flat. Suddenly, the frequency you've always spoken on becomes the only one they crave. They never reject you because you're unclear. They reject you because your timing always beats theirs. You bring the truth while they're still invested in illusion. And when someone arrives carrying insight that doesn't flatter their decisions, the instinct is to discredit, not to listen. It's easier to mock than to shift. But when the noise dies down and the mess gets loud, they lean into the very voice they used to label too much. The rejection was never about your accuracy. It was about their unpreparedness. You weren't wrong. You were early. And what once sounded abrasive now feels like grounding. They're not drawn to your voice because it changed. They're drawn to it because now they finally need what you were offering all along. They never had a hearing problem. They just weren't ready to hear what required responsibility. You never showed up for applause. You showed up because something in you couldn't stay silent while everything around you screamed. You weren't designed to entertain, you were sent to interrupt. But they turned your insight into spectacle, something to gossip about, something to dismiss as overreaction. They joked when you sounded the alarm because nothing had exploded yet. They heard urgency and labeled it drama. They called you heavy when you were carrying a warning no one else could see coming. But now the noise has turned into quiet desperation. The chuckles dried up. The same intensity that once made them uncomfortable is now the only clarity they trust. What they called ranting now feels like a roadmap. They thought you were shouting at shadows, but now the shadows are real, and they're reaching for the voice they tried to tune out. What hurts most isn't that they didn't listen. It's that they knew on some level you were speaking from a place they couldn't deny. They laughed anyway, not because you were ridiculous, but because the truth was too close. Now, they sit in the aftermath, and your voice, the one they labeled unnecessary, is the only one that saw the storm and still stood. You were never meant to be a talking point or a distraction. You were the anchor in the whirlwind. But since you didn't fit their image of what wisdom should look like, they missed their chance to avoid what they now live through. You weren't sent for applause. You were sent for awakening. They just didn't realize it until the silence became too loud to ignore. They built their confidence on recognition, on titles, applause, and being the most quoted voice in the room. They assumed their resume would protect them from reckoning. They believed having a seat at the table meant they'd never have to face the collapse. But truth doesn't check your status before it settles in. When real disruption shows up, it doesn't care if your name holds weight. It only cares if your words do. And in that moment, all the things they thought made them untouchable start to feel like paper badges in a burning room. They wrote you off because you didn't carry their credentials. You weren't packaged in prestige, weren't blessed by institutions they worship. To them, your voice wasn't official enough. But now, their polished platforms fall silent, and your raw clarity is the only one still ringing. The systems they trusted are unraveling, and the people they once paraded as examples vanish in the smoke. And you're still standing because you were never performing. They mistook your lack of status for a lack of authority. But now that the noise has cleared, it's evident. You never needed their titles to speak. What they chased in boardrooms and circles, you cultivated in solitude. While they performed for acceptance, you developed discernment. And that difference is what they couldn't buy, borrow, or fake. They leaned on reputation. You carried revelation. They couldn't handle your message because you weren't just delivering facts. You were disrupting comfort. You didn't come to reinforce their version of truth. You came to reveal what they weren't ready to admit, that the very foundations they call progress were already cracking. You didn't say it with venom. You said it with vision. But that vision felt like threat because it asked them to look closer, and most people would rather cover decay than confront it. So they called you divisive. They called you extreme. They pushed you to the margins because it was easier than facing themselves. You weren't rejected for being false. You were silenced for being accurate. You saw the fractures beneath the surface long before they splintered wide open. And now that they're knee-deep in the fallout, the very voice they once tried to mute becomes the only one that still makes sense. They never wanted truth. They wanted permission to stay numb, to stay safe, to stay shielded in routines that look righteous but rot underneath. You didn't offer comfort, you offered correction. And correction, that costs something. It costs ego. It costs illusion. It costs their carefully framed peace. You were too clear, too grounded, too direct. And that meant they couldn't use you as decoration. You refused to sugarcoat what needed to be torn down. You didn't pat dysfunction on the back and call it legacy. You didn't co-sign the performance. You called out the stage for what it was. And for that, they labeled you the enemy, until the collapse came knocking. Now they sit in the ruins of what they once defended, realizing the voice they silenced was the one that could have helped them build something that lasted. You weren't sent to be agreeable. You were sent to be accurate. And in the end, the difference between the two is what rewrites everything. There are people who carry insight not to spark fear, but to spark awakening. You weren't shouting for show. You were delivering signals from a place deeper than logic, and you knew what was rising long before it surfaced. But instead of leaning in, they tuned you out. Every time your message cut through the static, they changed the channel. Not because it was wrong, but because it interrupted their illusion of peace. You weren't chaotic, you were early, and they hated the timing more than the truth. They weren't annoyed by your voice, they were unsettled by what it asked them to face. You didn't bring disruption, you revealed what was already rotting beneath the surface. But people don't want to be interrupted mid-dream. They'd rather press pause than deal with the responsibility of awareness. So they laughed, they labeled, they shrugged it off like your urgency was exaggeration. They mistook mercy for noise and clarity for confrontation. You weren't trying to be the center, you were trying to keep the roof from collapsing. But the problem with waking people up is they'd rather call you a problem than admit the problem's already in the house. And when the walls finally buckle, they don't remember their jokes, they remember your voice. Because now, when the lights go out and the leaders disappear, yours is the only sound that still echoes with meaning. They're not reaching for you because you changed. They're reaching because everything else fell silent. And what they once dismissed as too much now feels like the only message that made sense all along. The signal wasn't late. They were just too comfortable to hear it when it came. You weren't just sent to alert, you were sent to embody the path out. They didn't see you as the model because you didn't look like what they idolized. They were too focused on shiny platforms and polished branding to recognize the blueprint standing in plain sight. You didn't talk theory, you lived strategy. While they clung to routines, you were carving out resilience in real time. They called you extra when you were actually prepared. You weren't moving for aesthetics, you were walking in structure. And now, as their frameworks fall and panic spreads, the same lifestyle they mocked becomes the map they're trying to recreate. They piece together scraps of advice, quoting lessons you've already moved beyond. While they chase gurus, you've been applying principles they ignored for years. You didn't wait to react. You lived the solution in advance. Not because you wanted to prove a point, but because you couldn't afford to gamble on comfort. You chose discipline when ease was trendy. You chose conviction when silence was safe. And now they see. You weren't preaching. You were demonstrating. What they called overreaction is now wisdom they chase. What they dismissed as strictness is now structure they wish they'd built. You weren't a backup. They just couldn't recognize foundation unless it came with fanfare. Now, as the dust clears, they realize the path forward isn't being written. It's been walked already. By you. Quietly. Consistently. Long before the world started asking the right questions. You don't get silenced because you're confusing. You get silenced because you speak with uncomfortable clarity. You walk into spaces where everyone agreed to keep quiet and break the illusion without raising your voice. You're not loud, you're exact. You don't dance around the truth or disguise it to make it easier to swallow. You walk in with language that doesn't ask for permission, and that's what unnerves them. Your words press on the pressure points they pretend aren't there. You don't just talk, you disarm. People aren't rejecting your message because it lacks value. They're avoiding it because it reveals theirs has been performative. You walk through conversations like a spotlight in a room full of projections, and they hate how clearly you make the invisible visible. You don't need to insult anyone to shake the ground. All you do is name what they've worked hard to bury. And that naming feels like exposure, even if you didn't aim it at anyone directly. You aren't sharp for attention. You're sharp because life made you precise. You aren't disruptive out of ego. You're disruptive because clarity always cuts through performance. Your message was never coated in fluff, so they dressed it in offense. They needed a reason to dismiss you because the truth in your tone made staying deluded harder. They didn't push you away because you lacked insight. They pushed you away because yours didn't serve their image. But time has a way of revealing what denial tries to mute. Now the same phrases they once scoffed at echo like instructions they wish they'd written down. Your voice, the one they once flinched at, is the one they now seek out. Not because you changed, but because reality finally caught up to your rhythm. They're not revering you now because you've shifted. They're revering you because the world has shifted toward you. You never raised your story to be pitied. You raised it to light a path. But they chose mockery over maturity, assuming your scars meant failure instead of preparation. They needed to believe your wounds were punishment, so they could keep calling their avoidance wisdom. They didn't understand that what you lived through was not just survival, it was a glimpse into what they'd eventually face. They watched you bleed and mistook it for spectacle, but it was always instruction.